Curt Collier, our leader for environmental advocacy. Curt has worked as an ethical culture leader for over 20 years, focusing primarily on environmental ethics and environmental justice. He is the National Youth Programs Director for Groundwork USA, working closely with the National Park Service as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Curt has created core-style programs allowing inner-city youth the opportunity to work at national parks and refuges. And this past summer, Curt directly managed the program for Yellowstone National Park, Shenandoah National Park, Grand Teton National Park, and the National Elk Refuge, bringing 150 youth from 18 cities across the U.S. His programs have won awards from both the Department of the Interior and the White House. Curt.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to hear that. I'm actually happy that this year the National Park Service has increased my programming, and I'm going to be taking about 250 kids across the United States to work at different national parks. So the program continues to grow, and we just got big funding from REI, a gracious donation from them, and I'm creating an additional 6 programs in cities across the United States where kids will learn kayaking and help reclaim urban streams and things like that. So it's been a very good year for us, luckily, and so I'm quite happy with that. I was, in 1991, I got accepted into the House Ear Institute in Los Angeles, which was quite prestigious at the time because I was just a young master's student. I just graduated from Texas Tech University. And the Ear Institute was a pretty prestigious place on problems of the ear. And of course, my master's work was in audiology. And so I got accepted to the House Ear Institute, and it was a pretty amazing place. They hired me to be an audiology intern, but I was so interested in the research that I got kind of enamored by the research department there. So imagine an entire teaching hospital, and about 3 or 4 floors were developed just to research. And I got to do some continued research there. I really loved it. And so I was often at bookstores and things like that trying to find books on the auditory system to continue the paper and the research that I had done for my master's work at Texas Tech University. And I'll never forget going over by Caltech because they had great used bookstores. You could go over there by the California Institute of Technology there in Pasadena and get all kinds of really, really cool books. And I was there, and of course, I saw this book called The Open Mind by J Robert Oppenheimer. And of course, the philosopher in me thought that's a pretty cool title, so I picked up the book. It's not really dense, easy to read. Thought it was really interesting and just kind of put it in my pile of books that I purchased that day. Well, that summer, I was going to go to vacation in New Mexico near Los Alamos at Bandelier National Park. Has anyone been to Bandelier? You gotta go. It's a beautiful, fantastic place. Yes, you've been there, yeah. I went to Bandelier right there at Los Alamos, the laboratory where Robert Oppenheimer worked. And I was going to read the book there as part of that. I took a friend of mine, and we had a bitter fight over the book. Because at night, what we would do after hiking trails is we'd read selections of it and then debate it. And he had a master's in engineering, and I had a master's in audiology, but I was also a philosophy student at Texas A&M, and we became such a bitter fight that it ruined the entire trip. And I didn't speak to the guy for another 10 years. So Oppenheimer ruined my life. No, but it was pretty amazing, and it was fun to get involved in. Not fun. It was interesting the vehemency of the debate that we were having and to go through it. It wasn't until years later, of course, while I was still, after I left the House Ear Institute, I went back to teach at Texas Tech University for a number of years and taught there at the Hill Science Center. And I remember reading Oppenheimer and became very more enamored by science and just the whole thing about science and of course, was there that I got decided that I wanted to be back into community life and ended up in ethical culture. So that's the long trip of how I got there. But what's fun about Oppenheimer is later on discovered that he had the same connection with the Society for Ethical Culture. And I'll tell you a little bit of that history. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, had come over with a wave of German immigrants in about the late 1800s, or turn of the century. And he came to New York City to work as a mercantile person in clothing wear. And he ended up working for an organization, a company some of you probably remember, called the Rothfeld Stern and Company, which is a big clothing manufacturer here at the time. He did really, really well. Julius Oppenheimer did. That's the father, Julius Oppenheimer. And they eventually got a big, nice apartment on 88th Street, right at Riverside Drive. Anyone live in that neighborhood? Some of you probably do. Yeah, so right around the corner there is that building where he lived. And that's where Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born. So his name, of course, is J Robert Oppenheimer. That J stands for his father's name of Julius. But of course, they didn't want that to sound so like the father or something like that, so they just called him Robert or Bobby. So Bobby Oppenheimer. Julius Oppenheimer, of course, became involved with the Society for an Ethical Culture about this time. In fact, he served on the board of trustees for this society and was in this building, after it was built, from 1907 to 1915. So for a long time, Oppenheimer's father was an active member of the society. Both him and his mother were active in this very building. His father became head of the finance committee, and of course at that time the Society for Ethical Culture met where? Carnegie Hall, right? We used to pack Carnegie Hall on Sundays. It was where we did all our Sunday morning meetings. And then they decided, when Julius Oppenheimer was on the board, he said, you know what we need our own building. Adler was against it originally, and in fact Henry Morgenthau is the one who came up with the most of the money, and he's the guy to put it way up here, way out of the city, up here on the Upper West Side, in a place that nobody hangs out with. And originally when they were offered the land, I told you the story, they were offered 20 acres from here all the way to the river. And they thought, what are they going to do with that land? So the society passed on it. They could have bought it at the time, which means we would have quite a little bit different history, I think. But his father then set out to raise the money, was part of this, and was a big wheeler dealer, close ally with Adler. And eventually on October 23rd in 1910 is when this building was dedicated. During the dedication ceremony, they all kind of marched into the auditorium downstairs. What happened to us today that we're up here and it's another religious group is down there? It's a little frightening. But October 23rd, 2010, they all come marching in the building, and there was Julius Oppenheimer in the front, leading this in this great, big, beautiful building dedication, and all these quite well-known people were there. Well, sitting in the audience with his mom was Julius Robert, or Robert Oppenheimer, who at that time was 6 years old. So he was just a little kid, but he actually remembered that. He remembered supposedly the dedication of the building. And talked about it and how austere and how it looked and how proud he was to see his father come marching into this building with all these famous dignitaries. His parents, of course, being quite wealthy, they led their son with a pretty wealthy kind of life. And back then, of course, if you were Jewish, you didn't want to attract too much attention. And so part of what they did, of course, is they really, really supported a lot of other kind of work for other immigrants that were coming into the country. And in fact, it was the Oppenheimers who really supported Elliott and Hudson Guild and gave large amounts of money to all these other organizations, including, remember, we used to own tenement houses all through the South, down here in Chelsea, and Hudson Guild formed eventually. And his father played a significant role in making a lot of donations to that. Adler eventually was accepted into Philston Ethical Culture School and went here, right next door, for many, many years. So just think, right down this, on the other side of this door over here is the school. And that's where he went there. He was actually a very, very bright student, as you can imagine. He was a pretty gifted kind of kid. And but the problem was he was just too active in class and too much of a loner and always caused problems. And in fact, his math teacher found him to be a particular problem. And partially because Robert Oppenheimer was so brilliant that he just kept not wanting to sit in class. So his teacher decided to do a special trick. What he would do is Robert would come into the room and his teacher would hand him an extremely difficult math problem and then send him to the library. That's what he did. And he told Oppenheimer to come back at the end of the class and tell people the answer. And that's what he did. So he would send him off with these difficult things, and by himself, Robert would figure out the math, and then we'd come back to the end of class and talk about it. He was quite this smart little kid. But it was really his science teacher, his physics teacher, that really got him interested in there. A guy by the name, sometimes I had to look down, August Clock. And August Clock was quite a gifted teacher of his day, and really spurred Robert's desire to learn physics and those kinds of stuff. Adler graduated from the school by the way, in 1921, just so you can put this in perspective of where we are. He graduated from the Ethical Culture School in 1921. Anybody here graduate Philstone Ethical Culture School? There we go. Can I ask what year you graduated? No, you're not 1921, but I'm saying, what year did you graduate?
From Philstone?
Yes.
1948.
1948. Do you?
I remember Mr. Clark.
You do?
Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. Was he a great teacher?
Science is not my stuff.
I hear you. So, okay. Well, thank you. That's very interesting. I love talking to ethical culture people here in New York, as opposed to when I travel to other ethical culture societies, because people here were there when this happened, and when all these things happened. I just love that, or new people who were referred to. Unfortunately, of course, in 1917, World War I broke out. And originally, of course, the society, like most Americans, didn't know how to respond to World War I. This was a disturbance that was going on in Europe. It really didn't seem to involve us. Originally, Americans were isolationists and kind of pulled back from that. And that went on for quite a long time. Felix Adler, of course, hated militarism, and that was the founder of the ethical culture movement. And he spoke a lot in that period of time about the war and about things that were going on. And specifically, he gave a speech about how much he hated what science was doing in the war. That people were bringing in sciences, and the scientists were creating, who were supposed to be enlightened people and people who had knowledge and people who should know better. They were being brought into the war to develop ever more deadly bombs and equipment and military armaments and those kinds of stuff. And Adler wrote in 1916, "The time will come when the scientist will be considered and will consider himself a disgrace to the human race who prostitutes his knowledge of nature's forces for the destruction of his fellow man." What was interesting about that speech is that Oppenheimer also remembered that speech. He was in the audience when Adler gave that talk. And there was great debate about what kind of science should be taught at ethical culture school, because they didn't want kids who were supposed to be learning about ethics to grow up to use their brilliant minds for destructive purposes. And there was a big debate about what was going on in there. Of course, the United States entered into World War I on April 6, 1917. And when they came in, of course, the Germans were so angry about all this outside involvement that they started sinking with U-boats all of the cargo ships that came across there. And in fact, his father, who was head of a big manufacturing firm, hiring mostly German immigrants and doing this kind of science, knew about these and probably discussed it. So probably Robert Oppenheimer was probably in the school getting involved in the discussion on the war and about science, listening to Adler and his admonitions about scientists, and then going home and listening to his father talk about the impact this was having on business and the other kinds of things, and the escalation, and the fact that they were Germans, no doubt, of course, added to this German heritage. This went on. This, by the way, created a crisis in ethical culture. Believe it or not, there was a schism that happened here. And the schism happened between those who were kind of supporting the war, like Adler. Adler believed that we should defend democracy And eventually he started, like Woodrow Wilson said, that we need to come to the aid of the nation and defend this great experiment that we have in this country and push forward for democracy. On the other side of the room was Eliot, John Lovejoy Eliot, of course, who was a pacifist. In fact, Eliot was so upset what was going on with the war that he and some others got together and founded the what organization? American Civil Liberties Union, right, ACLU. And the idea was that they were supposed to get together to fight and protect against pacifists, which is what the ACLU did at the beginning, which was really to people, men who did not want to, out of good conscience, go into World War I and be a part of that. So there was really quite a great big conflict. But then, of course, when America entered the war, just like it always seems to be, if you express any discontent about the war, you're labeled as un-American. And in fact, the fact that many of the people of the Society for Ethical Culture, including Felix Adler and others like the Oppenheimers, were Germans, did not help them at all. In fact, at this time it became popular for many German Jews to change their name. That's the reason why perhaps Robert Oppenheimer was called Robert and Bobby during this time. And it was really a big thing. In fact, one of the funniest things I was reading in this history in the book about Oppenheimer was how they stopped calling sauerkraut in the United States. What did they call it, do you know?
Liberty cabbage.
Liberty cabbage. See? I can talk to you and you know these things. How do you know that? Where do you just store that in your mind? It reminds me of us in Iraq when the French would not let us fly over during the war. Of course, we did away with French fries and called them what? Freedom fries. Yes. It's remarkable, though, how much the society really got involved into this now about the fear of being labeled, of course, un-American, being feared that we were already a hotbed of liberalism at the time. Of course, Adler worked really closely with Samuel Gompers, who was a member and founder of the American Labor. Say it again? There you go. You all know. Samuel Gompers was a member of the society, and the labor big struggles that were going on here, of course. And so on Easter morning, 1917, after the United States declared war on Germany and went into World War I, Adler came walking in to the main auditorium carrying a what? An American flag. Adler, Easter morning, 1917. I think that's today, right? That's not 1917, but it's pretty close. Adler comes, Easter morning, Adler comes walking into the auditorium carrying a huge American flag. Henry Newman, who was an ethical culture leader, joked later on, looked like Jesus coming in carrying the cross. Because probably it also pained Adler to somewhat do this kind of militarism, this kind of thing, but he thought it was important at that time. Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical culture movement, of course, we've always been very, very big supporters of American democracy, felt it important on Easter morning to walk into the auditorium downstairs carrying a big now American flag. And he argued in a speech that morning called the national crisis that that's what we were here to do. That we must at all times, ladies and gentlemen, defend democracy against any form of threat, and even if that means that we must go to war. And so this was a really big thing. In the summer of that year, 1917, believe it or not, they shut the school down, and during the summer, the veterans who were returning for World War I were housed right here next door down the hallway, and this is where they brought them back. They converted it to a temporary hospital in that year. They also had shelters that brought them in clothes when the soldiers came back. You remember many of them didn't get the funding that they were supposed to get, and they were supported by the Ethical Society after they returned from the war. It's interesting that at that time, Oppenheimer was really into thinking about these things, and he was a young man during all this stuff was going on. And he wrote a piece of poetry, and I wanted to read you a selection of Oppenheimer's poems. And this is after the armistice. And so at the school newspaper that they used to have next door, Oppenheimer wrote this. This gift of world dominion in its passage west, rich Spain and glorious France in turn has blessed, and Dutch and conquering English, whose broad flag unfurled in all the treasured corners of this fertile world, She blessed the Germans and has swiftly left once more, and now has crossed the sea unto our newer shore to bide with us. But as the lovely Corinth and Tyre of boundless fame, we've come to grandeur, but to fall and disappear in flame. And all that lasts the ages through shall be our glorious name. Pretty highfalutin stuff for a high school kid at the time, writing in this stuff. It was a pretty amazing thing. Robert Oppenheimer got accepted to Harvard. He was such a brilliant student. He went there, but in his first year that he was there, he got colitis. And so his father hired his English teacher from the Philston School to take him to New Mexico for a vacation to get better. Remember, that's what you did in the old days. You went out to the country to get better. And he had a school buddy there, and so they traveled down to New Mexico near Albuquerque. In fact, they visited some of those areas, which is the reason why in the future Oppenheimer would choose Los Alamos, which is in New Mexico, as the site of that. He was such a brilliant student, he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Then he got accepted to Cambridge. He studied there only 2 years, because at that time the hotbed of physics was in Germany. And so he went to Göttingen, Germany, and studied there. Think about who was there at the time: Werner Heisenberg, Pascal Jordan, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller. All these brilliant physicists in one university. Of course, I don't know if he knew German or not. I think he actually was a polyglot and spoke different languages, but he got his PhD there in 1927. Quite the smart guy. He then returns to the United States. Robert Oppenheimer does, and gets accepted to Caltech University, which is the reason why I found the book in the bookstore near there. Caltech was great because you could do all kinds of physics there, and he became more interested in astrophysics. Right there, if you know Los Angeles, near Pasadena, there's the Griffith Observatory. It's this really cool spot. Has anyone been there? It's this really, really cool thing. Yeah, I love when you walk in the door, there's the big meter right there. They filmed like 1,000 movies there. Right there's the Hollywood sign. And of course, way up high above that is Mount Wilson Observatory. And this really phenomenal place. I worked as a docent naturalist, believe it or not, in the foothills right there, because I lived in La Crescenta, which is right there near that area. And I would volunteer. That was my first job, working as a docent naturalist. And I would take people on night hikes from Los Angeles into the mountains there at the San Bernardino Mountains. And it became very popular. It got written up in the LA Times, and then it got too big, and the people told me to shut it down because I had all these people coming in the night to do night hikes. And it was really cool though, because you'd hike around this mountain trail, and you'd come around the corner, and there was all the lights of Los Angeles. It was absolutely spectacular. And you could see where they didn't build because of the fault. So that's why I wanted people to go there at night, so you could see the San Andreas Fault where it travels, because there was no big buildings, there was very little light there. And you could also see the inversion layer, the smog layer. So it was a great little history thing I did there. He also became enamored of the area where, of course, there was Caltech, but also there was these 2 great observatories, and he became very interested in astrophysics. And that's where he, of course, made his early claim to fame. He was such a brilliant guy that he wrote the first paper predicting that there would be black holes. That's what a great guy was. That he predicted that there would be black holes way before they were discovered. Unfortunately, the world was changing during all this was going on. And it was the Germans who had first theorized the possibility of nuclear fission, of actually breaking apart atoms and releasing their energy. 2 German scientists had worked this out in 1938. And there was a great deal of fear that the Germans, who were now, would learn how to do this. And so some American scientists approached, because of what was happening in the political climate in Europe, approached the president and said that we really need to figure out how to build a bomb using fission power before they built a bomb using that. And so that we needed to be ahead of the game. The president at that time said it sounded like a good idea. And so he put in charge of that the Army Corps of Engineers. They wanted to keep it kind of secret. Group that was stationed right here in New York City. So therefore the whole project was called the what project? The Manhattan Project. Of course you know this. The Manhattan Project, because there were 10 sites here in Manhattan where they were conducting experiments on nuclear fission and all this kind of stuff. Of course, Enrico Fermi is doing his work over at the University of Chicago, where he created the first nuclear fission, which I'll get into later on. But here in Manhattan is where they were doing a lot of the theoretical research also at Columbia University. And so there were all these things that were going on. The problem was they thought that there were too many spies and too many liberals in Manhattan. I've never found any here, but I'm sure they exist. And so they decided that they needed to move the research out of this area and move it to a more secret location. And it was Oppenheimer, remembering New Mexico, says, I have just the place, way in the middle of nowhere, no one goes there. A place called Los Alamos, we can build a laboratory up there. By the way, if you go to visit Los Alamos, it's a lot of fun. You can go there. It's all these physics research stuff goes on there. They have this great little museum, and you can walk in the door. That's the first time I ever understood how fusion, because at that time we were working in fusion. Fusion work, they had a little science thing, and you grab both ends, and you push, and you could fill it straight, and all of a sudden it just pulled together like this. And then this explosion would go off on the screen. I went, oh, that's kind of clever. That's what fusion is, okay.
You didn't blow yourself up.
Yeah, I did blow myself up. It's a great little laboratory. You can visit there. They have a walking tour. So if you're thinking of something to do this summer, I highly recommend it. Just because Bandelier is next door, which is one of my favorite national parks. While he was there, of course, he brought in all of these brilliant scientists, and they dedicated their time to figuring out how to make the bomb. They decided to blow the bomb up at Trinity site, which is a location south of Socorro, New Mexico, and north of Los Alamos, Alamogordo. And if you go there, it's pretty amazing. I ski at Ski Apache because in Texas there is no place to go skiing in our entire state. The only place we have to go if you're from Texas is to go to Rio Doce, New Mexico, because it's the closest mountain. And so everybody you meet there is from Texas. And you go there, and the people in New Mexico love that. And so you go to the top of this mountain, and you go up this 14,000-foot peak there, and at the very top of the mountain, they have a little shack. And this gondola brings you up there, so you can go up there even if you don't ski. At the very top of the mountain, you can look over, and it's this cool valley. Way off in the distance, you see the White Sands National Park down there. It's really cool. In the north, you see the lava flows where the volcano's there, and right in the middle is this big flat area. That's Trinity site. You can actually see it from the top of the mountain. You can only visit it a couple of times a year. He's the one who came up with the name for Trinity site, which is where the first atomic bomb was exploded. He called it that because of a piece of poetry from John Donne about the Trinity and about the awfulness of that. And basically, they built the bomb there to see if they could get it to go off. And so on July 16, 1945, where were you if you were still alive at that time? Do you remember where you were? They exploded the first atomic bomb in the desert right there at the Trinity site. He said that when he looked at it, he reminded himself, Oppenheimer did, of the Bhagavad Gita, the book, the Hindu holy scriptures. And he quoted, if the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. But then years later, he also remembered the story from the Bhagavad Gita about Vishnu, who was trying to convince the prince that you had to go into battle, that battle is horrible and destructive, and suddenly Vishnu turns into this armed god with all these swords. And he says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And that's the line that Oppenheimer thought about mostly. I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. Sure enough, it became true because on August the 6th, 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber piloted by, called the what? Enola Gay, of course, by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 80,000 people were killed instantaneously. Another 166,000 died within the radiation poisoning. And then, of course, they repeated it a little short time later in Nagasaki, the first and last times, John, you're correct, the atomic bomb. After that, of course, Oppenheimer, who really realized what he had done, thought deeply about what had just happened. That we had taken something from nature so powerful, so potentially wonderful, but so destructive, and dropped it on cities in Japan, of course, to end the war. And I'll let you debate in your own mind about that. It was Oppenheimer then who, after the war, said, you know what, we need to find more peaceful ways to use this experiment. Enrico Fermi had already, at his Chicago pile, had created the first fusion reaction, of course, during the Manhattan Project. And one of the things that Oppenheimer thought is that perhaps we could use nuclear power for energy purposes. And that's when they first started thinking about the possibility of nuclear reactors. Unfortunately, this was during a different time. In 1949, so only a few years later, we exploded the first atomic bomb in 1945. In 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. So it wasn't much long after that they figured out they were already rushing to do this kind of stuff, and they did this. Which of course created a huge scare in the United States that now the Soviets, who were now creeping back into Europe and taking over large swaths of land, would use this bomb against the West and against democracy as well. The Red Menace had come upon there. In the 1930s, the United States had created something called the House Committee on Un-American Affairs. And they originally were created to look for Nazi sympathizers out during 1938 during World War II. But at this time, they directed their attention to looking for closet communists. Now, they turned their attention to Oppenheimer and his father, Julius Oppenheimer, and the Society for Ethical Culture. Did you know there were spies here in the early 50s, of course, spying on you people because you're a bunch of communist sympathizers? I mean, it would make sense. Samuel Gompers was a member here. Many people were openly communists. Adler himself was against the Communist Party, not for any other reason other than the fact that he thought that really what we should do is not say this is how people should live, but to create the means in which we collectively can explore that question, rather than once again just coming up with another answer. He thought the communists were no different than the religion of its day by saying this is how people should live. And Adler said that's not what we're saying. We appreciate the fact that they want to deal with labor and all those other issues, but what we really need to do is create the mechanism. So he himself was never a communist, although he was extremely pro-labor. And for a lot of people, of course, that was the same thing as being a communist, right? Bernie Sanders, how does he get away with calling himself a socialist in the United States is pretty amazing. Just in my mind, just like, God, this guy says he's an outspoken socialist. And of course, for a lot of people in this room, they probably have his love and support because of that. The fact that he has those kinds of stuff. Oppenheimer's own brother was a member of the Communist Party, as was his, by the way, his mistress, and some other people who were members of the Communist Party. And when the Oppenheimers lived in Los Alamos, they had people who come to visit them who were communist sympathizers. So there was a lot of fresh stuff there. His brother, Frank Oppenheimer, eventually becomes attacked by the House Committee of Un-American Activities under McCarthy. He eventually gets labeled a communist, loses his teaching job at the University of Minnesota, moves to Colorado and becomes a cattle rancher. So this is Oppenheimer's own brother. His brother eventually donates large amounts of money to science. And of course, was one of the major donors for the Exploratorium in San Francisco. If any of you have been to that great science museum up there, Exploratorium. So there were a lot of problems here. In 1954, John Foster Dulles believes that the Americans should foster a new kind of policy towards the Soviet Union called mutually assured destruction, as you remember. That would become the American process, is that the only way to stop the Red Menace was for us to arm ourselves to the teeth, in which case then if the Soviets tried anything, no one would win, and we would have this policy, of course, that persisted almost to this day. In 1954, Oppenheimer, who had been investigated for a decade, was eventually brought to trial. Actually, when the government had secret police tailing him all the time, and they already knew about his activities and knew about lots of things. The trial did not go very well. The ACLU defended him. In fact, Lloyd Garrison defended him. Lloyd Garrison was the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, famous abolitionist, a Unitarian minister, and it was also helpful at the founding of the Ethical Society. Was a big friend of Adler's. and they were all there. And of course, in 1954, in a very, very heated trial, do anyone remember that at all? 1954, J Robert Oppenheimer loses his security clearance and then falls off the edge of the screen as far as it goes. I want to then talk a little bit about what were Oppenheimer's two biggest concerns. His two biggest concerns. The first I got from this book right here, and the second I got after this book was written. His first concern was that atomic energy is so complex. It's so difficult to understand. The nature of the science is so intense that we need openness. Scientists can only advance the science of nuclear energy if they're all talking about it, researching and arguing them together. Think of CERN, the super collider now in Switzerland, where you can have an Iranian physicist working next to an Israeli physicist in the same space as they all try to figure out the elementary particles of the universe. That's what he thought of the science of atomic energy in his day. That the only way that we would ever be able to use it for any purpose is if we had complete openness. And that it was that secrecy that would eventually kill it all. Secrecy is what leads it into wrong kinds of problems, and secrecy is what stops us from dealing with it adequately. And so he wrote The Open Mind not because he wanted people to have open minds about thinking about different things, but that we should have a society that allowed people to openly explore things and issues and problems and to think about them openly rather than just relegating them to secrecy or only allowing a few people to do that. Unfortunately, that was the complete opposite of what was going on in politics at that day. The second concern that he had, in fact, is that came after his 1954 lack of security plans. And his fear is that science was becoming so complex that the average layperson, who probably doesn't even understand half the stuff that's being said, we struggle to understand relativity, and now they've given quantum mechanics, which tells us that a particle can appear here through multiple universes, travel around the moon a couple times, and then back here within a second, and we go, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And he worried, how can we do that? How can we take things which are so complex that we don't understand them? And he thought the only way that we could do that was to come back to community. That community collectively, there are some people who are very smart at science, and they must do the science, but they must come back to us and help us understand everything about the science. We need to understand everything that's going on with the science. I appreciated John bringing up Fukushima, thank you very much, and talking about the nuclear power plant in Japan, because that is kind of one of the issues that we were into, is the fact that while many of us, of course, are pro-science and love the fact that we can actually use nuclear fission, we haven't figured out fusion yet, except at very high temperatures, that we can figure out nuclear fission and use it for energy, we are also quite aware that there are problems about nuclear fission as well. What do we do with the waste? How do we run our nuclear reactors? This society has decided to take up this issue itself. In fact, we sponsored here last October a group of people run by the National Resource Defense Council and Clearwater, who came into this room, sponsored by a lovely doctor by the name of Dr. Alpern, who brought all these people together. And what they did is they explored the issues that we have about nuclear energy to this day. And the problems are manifold. In fact, we're going to have a whole gathering in this room 1 month from now, led by me. I'm going to bring in some scientists and some researchers from the nuclear energy as well as Clearwater, and we're going to have a frank discussion about that. Because while we can talk about the benefits of nuclear energy in this country, we've never talked about what to do with our aging fleet of nuclear reactors. We've never talked about what to do. Even if we shut down Indian Point nuclear power plant, which some in this room would celebrate and others would, of course, decry because they think it's going to cause more fossil fuels, we don't have any plans for shutting it down. There's no money to shut it down. There's nothing even to talk about it because some people think there need to be some secrets about that, and we shouldn't give away those secrets, which is the complete opposite of what Oppenheimer was talking about. Oppenheimer, of course, in 1967 eventually gets throat cancer. They tried multiple radiation, of course, treatments, which is ironic, to try and cure him of that. And of course, he eventually dies on February 18, 1967. After he loses his security clearance, by the way, him and his wife purchased a couple of acres of Gibney Beach at St. John's in the Virgin Islands. Some of you have probably been to the Virgin Islands, been to Gibney Beach, was right there. He actually now converts that into, eventually gets converted into a local park. That was part of his land. His wife has him cremated, takes his ashes and scatters them in the water right there because she felt like she wanted to return the elements that he was back to the elements of the university and created him. She dies 5 years later, and the same thing happens to her, and then her assets are donated to St. John's. 2 days before the Trinity test, Oppenheimer wrote in his diary some of his fears about atomic energy and about what it means for us to work on such things and to make, are we going to make them good or the bad? And he wondered how people would think about him and think about his legacy as an ethical culturist who eventually grows up to create one of the most destructive weapons in the history of the world. And he pens in his diary another quote from the Bhagavad Gita. In battle, in the forests, at the precipice in the mountains, on the dark great sea in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep, in confusion, in the depths of shame, the good deeds of a man, the good deeds a man has done before defend him. The good deeds a man has done before defended him. And he hoped that some of the good deeds that he had tried to do would defend him as well as he returns back to the universe. And it's the challenge that we think about even to this day. Thank you very much.